Welcome to this special bonus episode of Talk Commerce. On April 8, 2022, Magento organized and hosted an unconference in Orlando, Florida. I had the pleasure of interviewing each of the sponsors at the event. I would encourage you to visit and learn more about what each does. I'm also happy to announce the Talk Commerce newsletter called Platforms. I'll be covering news from the major commerce platforms as well as technologies that are related to e-commerce. I will also have an Entrepreneur's Corner to share some experiences that other entrepreneurs are going through. I would encourage you to sign up today at talkcommerce.com. The first issue comes out on June 1st. Over the next 9 weeks, you'll enjoy interviews from SwiftOtter, SalesLater, Image Engine, Clayvu, WebScale, Nexus, Adobe, JetRails, and Celigo. Each of these sponsors showed up to the event and participated in the unconference. And now, Talk Commerce, live from Unconference, Florida. Welcome to this search edition of Talk Commerce. I have Dan Griffin from Clayvu. Dan, tell us what your day-to-day role is and tell us about Clayvu.
Sure, Brent, appreciate it. So my day-to-day role is head of partnerships, and Clayvu is a product discovery suite, usually led in that conversation or that category by search, which then also includes things like category merchandising and product recommendations. We integrate with most commerce platforms, but we don't have to have an out-of-the-box integration to work. You know, what we're core focused on is really helping that merchant's buyer convert at a higher rate and getting relevant products into the checkout box to also raise that cart value. It's a pretty interesting model at the moment because we're seeing shopping behavior from the pandemic really change the value of what search and product recommendations and category merchandising means to commerce. So it's not a technology play as much as it's an approach, and the technology needs to support the approach.
Yeah, the typical, let's just say the vertical for search, which we would think that's one thing, and then we might have another vertical for recommendations. So you're putting them all together and helping the merchant, helping the buyer find better products on the merchant's website.
I think that's a perfect way to describe it, and I'll give you an example. We have a client, and they're a spice company, but they don't have a lot of products. So you would think naturally a search tool needs a large product catalog. Well, what was important to this merchant was leveraging their content and the recipes that they had that went with their products. So we also go, in this case, and leverage their content, their CMS, to then pull forward from an artificial intelligence perspective the right products based on maybe their behavior in the content that they've searched. Or we can also bring back, hey, here's recipes that you might like based on what you're searching for. I want to have a chicken soup or whatever it happens to be, or what spices go with that. And so it's interesting that search is broadened really more toward that customer's buying experience.
Yeah, and it's pepper, by the way.
Oh, pepper?
Unless it's matzo ball soup, you might want to add a little salt, you never know. The content is something that really is pushing into e-commerce nowadays, and you mentioned the search and bringing up a recipe. A merchant, in that case, would bring up the products or the spices that go along with that recipe, so it helps them to drive revenue through content. And a lot of search engines ignore that content, and I think traditionally, the Magento out of the box doesn't include the content that's coming along, and they only include the products.
Well, it's personalized intent, right? The buyer shows up on your site. When they search for something, they're showing a devoted intent message to the merchant with what they're looking for. And with Clayvu, you can learn over time what these personas look like, but at that moment, you have a very small window of time to get the right product with the right sphere of influence. So to your point, pairing up those spices with the recipes, it makes a lot of sense because it answers two questions at once for this particular buying type. And you can do this across a ton of industries.
What are you seeing coming down the next year now in e-commerce, but also in content? I think there's also revenue in just straight up content. But what are you seeing in both of those categories?
Sure. So I think what the next year to 2 years looks like, we just released our benchmark report, which is an independent study around the state of product discovery and search and where do we see the market going. And one of the interesting things is natural language processing, which is the buzzword, but the reality is everyone's talking to their devices. And if your site, whatever form factor happens to be, whether it's mobile, whether it's laptop, whether it's a smart IoT device, everyone's talking to their devices more and more every day. The younger buyers are moving into being more influential. So we see this ability to not just process natural language, but process complex query within natural language. So it's one thing to say, show me brown boots. It's a whole nother thing to say, I want to see brown boots that are under $100 that are artificially manufactured and not from animal skin, which is a very complex query. That's where this is going. The inflationary economy is absolutely forcing complicated queries upon merchants, and a lot of it has to do with most affordable. And I think you'd be surprised that 75% of current merchants, just with search in general, so that's the whole sphere, 75% can't process natural language, let alone complicated query. So they're just leaving revenue and recommendations on the table. And that's where we see this going, because as the economy continues to be more difficult to operate in for the near term, buying is going to be more complicated because they're going to do more research and want kind of a better line of sight to something that fits their needs.
Yeah, and I think more and more people are going to be using Siri or Alexa or Hey Google for all those searches. Certainly I use those devices to find some of the things that I need. And the most frustrating part is when it says, hey, I can't find any, or whatever Alexa says, I don't have anything to do. Like, you want your content to be found, and that voice commerce, I think, is what the buzzword is nowadays, is what we're looking for. And a great one is just recipes, and then being able to monetize that content.
Well, I think you hit on something that's super important. We all get frustrated when we ask our device a question, I can't find that, or I'm not able to understand. Imagine now you're a buyer, you're a merchant, and the buyer comes to your site, and the search result shows 0 results, and isn't smart enough to at least recommend something based on intent. Like, you can do that with Clevu, you can do that with other providers too, but 0 results is bad, right? You can't live there. I use the example all the time. I have 2 teenage kids. I have a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old. They don't type, they talk to their device. They're the ones that are putting things in your Amazon cart. They're the ones that are asking you to go to Converse.com because they want the latest Chuck Taylors, and they're searching based on voice. And this is just the simple entryway. To your point, there's a lot of other things that are happening and simple steps for folks to leverage recommendations and merchandising. But just look around at the younger buying type and how they behave. And I think if merchants continue to pay more attention to that, they'd be much better off in positioning the products that they need to merchandise and sell.
And if you're a user worried that your kids are going to start buying stuff on your Alexa, they also have voice recognition to make sure it's you asking for that pair of size 12 Converse All-Stars.
That's true.
Dan, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for supporting Unconference. I really appreciate the attendance and coming to see our talks today.
Awesome. Thanks, Brent. We appreciate Magento.
Yep. Thank you again for listening. My name is Brent Peterson, and it has been a pleasure to be your host today. Please sign up for our newsletter platforms at talk-commerce.com. Rate and subscribe to Talk Commerce wherever you download your podcasts. New shows out every week.